Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of the Romantic Era. And as I've done with previous eras or units, I'm going to start with the dates of this era, and then I'll talk about the word Romanticism. And it's easy to deal with the dates, 1820 and 1900. There's really no particular significance to these dates at all. It's one of these cases where we just kind of have to pick a year. And it's in that regard, it's similar to, when we talked about the transition from the Baroque into the Classical era, and now from the Classical era into the Romantic era. Remember I said that 1750, which was the year that we use for the beginning of the Classical period, there's no particular significance about that period. The style was changing gradually over a period of decades, and really the only reason we choose 1750 is it happens to be the year that J.S. Bach died, and it's also right there in the middle of the 18th century. It's kind of like a convenient place to choose. But remember, on the significance of J.S. Bach dying that year, Bach was already, in the last couple decades of his life, composing in a style which had come to be thought of as kind of old-fashioned. The style had already started to move on into what we call the classical style, right? So even Bach's death in 1750, we can't really say that that changed musical style at all. It had already started to move on. Similarly, we have a gradual transition out of the classical period into the Romantic era, and there's nothing particularly special about 1820. In fact, I would say that Romanticism as a cultural movement, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm not really going to be talking necessarily so much about the Romantic era in music, because Romanticism is much bigger than that. It is a cultural movement that incorporates all of the arts, culture, politics, and much more, actually. It's just a vast subject. And if we had to look at when it begins, if we had to pick a date when the general cultural movement begins, I'd say it's well before 1820. So in fact, very often we speak of 19th century Romanticism, meaning all of the 1800s, in the same way that we speak of 18th century Enlightenment, right? And there's also nothing particular about 1900. Again, it's a year right at the end of the century or the beginning of the next century, so we have to pick a year. But there are the movement out of Romanticism into the 20th century is again gradual, and there's no particular significance other than the fact that it's a year that ends in two zeros, and it conveniently kind of brackets the 19th century, the 1800s. So we might as well pick that year. All right. Now, I am going to talk about what is meant by Romanticism and romantic, but before I do that, probably the best thing to do would be for you to kind of cast aside your common sense notion of the word romantic and what it means. Romantic is a word that we use fairly often, sort of like the word classic, right? But unlike the word Baroque. Right? Baroque is kind of an obscure word that pertains particularly to the arts, and it's a word we don't use very much, so I had to explain that word quite a bit. The word classic is a word that we all use, and the meaning of the word classic or classical, our common usage of it, is actually helpful, a good starting point in talking about music of the classical era, or the classical approach to the arts, and what are the sort of the values associated with that approach, right? So your common sense understanding of the word classical is actually helpful in that case. Probably not in the case of romantic, because when I say the word romantic, you probably think of romantic love. You think of a candlelit dinner, a dozen roses on Valentine's Day, and all that kind of thing. Well, romantic love is one aspect of romanticism, like capital R romanticism, this cultural movement I'm going to be talking about, but it is not really that significant a part. It's only one small part. So probably the best thing to do is just to sort of kind of forget your common sense understanding or definition of that word that you might have in your head, and kind of start over again. Let's actually look at the word itself. Have you ever wondered, well, what does romantic or romance have to do with Rome? I mean, there's clearly something about Rome and Romans in there. Where's that coming from? Well, it has to do with the Romance languages, that is, the languages that were descended from Latin and gradually over time became Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese. And there were these epic poems written in the late Middle Ages in the Romance languages, French especially, that were these long epic poems, these tales of knights in shining armor. There's another romantic image, who are slaying dragons and saving damsels in distress, or fighting glorious battles, right? And anything that is reminiscent of those times, of like medieval times actually, and this is an aspect of Romanticism, 19th century Romanticism, this kind of one of many aspects that I'll talk about, but this sort of enthusiasm for the Middle Ages and the culture of the Middle Ages. This is an aspect of Romanticism, and that's even where it gets its word from. When you look at a ruined castle up on a hill somewhere, you might say, oh, that's so romantic. What's romantic about it is the fact that it's a castle, which is from the Middle Ages, and you can look at it and imagine, knights in armor riding out to do battle, so that's the connection. And that's where we get the word romantic from, because of these romances or epic, heroic poems written in the Romance languages in the late Middle Ages. All right. Okay, well, that's sort of the etymology of the word. What does the word actually mean? We're going to take quite a while to explain all the implications of this word, and let's start with what the book says. It says, the early 19th century brought the flowering of Romanticism, a cultural movement that stressed emotion, imagination, and individuality. In part, Romanticism was a rebellion against the neoclassicism of the 18th century and the Age of Reason. So let's just take those two sentences first. A cultural movement that stressed emotion, imagination, and individuality. Okay, well, as opposed to what? Well, think of what the previous sort of cultural movement that we talked about, the Enlightenment, what did it stress? Not so much emotion, but reason, right? The typical Enlightenment philosopher, classically minded thinker would say reason is the key to everything, to our understanding of the world, because after all, look at what the advances of the age of scientific discovery, look at all the things that we've discovered by using reason, by using the scientific method, and look at how all those discoveries in time have made our lives better, right? And so if we can only continue using our brains and casting away old traditions and superstitions and ways of organizing society, right? Like having the nobility and having the clergy having so much power, right? Because that's, after all, it's irrational. The only reason that we do that is because that's what our fathers and their fathers before them did. It's just tradition, just continuing blindly on, right? So, whereas the Enlightenment stresses reason, the Romanticism, the Romantic approach stresses emotion. It's sort of like a head versus heart kind of thing. What else it says here? Emotion, imagination, and individuality. Well, certainly there's imagination going on in the age of Enlightenment, but what they're referring to here is, I think, what the implication is, imagination. It's sort of irrational modes of imagination, something that's taking place at a deeper level beneath, the logical mind. Um, Daydreams, fantasies, uh, dreams, that you have when you're asleep, nightmares, drug-induced altered states, right? These are all things that the Romantics were interested in. They were interested sort of like bypassing the logical, rational mind and getting to what's underneath, right? And also individuality. And I think, well, individuality. I mean, we all like individuality. Right? We like expressing emotions and imagination and individuality, right? And I guess I could pause here and say, just as I said in regard to the Enlightenment, that is, that we are all products of the Enlightenment. The country that we live in, the United States of America, is itself a product very much of Enlightenment thinking. And we today, 250 years later, walk around with all these sort of like assumptions that we inherited from that time. At least hopefully we do, I think. Ideas like all people should be created equal, we should have freedom of speech, we should have separation of church and state. We shouldn't have like titles of nobility. You're no better than me just because your father was an aristocrat and my father was a shoemaker or whatever, right? Equality. All of these are ideas that we get from the Enlightenment. This idea of individuality being a virtue unto itself is something that I think is definitely a Romantic idea that people, I think, didn't really have so much as part of their sort of like mental software. Now, I think you can point to several different figures as sort of like the origin of this idea. Maybe Rousseau, who is sort of, I think you can look at the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau as sort of like maybe the great granddaddy of the Romantic movement, although he lived in the 18th century. But by individuality, kind of like what we might say is like nonconformity. The idea that you don't have to conform to society's rules and expectations for you. You should instead be true to your own inner self. And if you are true to your own inner self, then that's all that matters, right? You shouldn't conform to society, right? The idea of like the rebel against society, or the misunderstood, especially the artistic type, who is sort of like separates himself from society or is misunderstood or rejected by society and rebels against it. The loner, the lone wolf, all of these are very much Romantic notions, right? And to the extent we find these appealing, then we are kind of like subscribing to that Romantic point of view. It says here, again, this other sentence, in part, Romanticism was a rebellion against the neoclassicism of the 18th century and the Age of Reason. I would say Romanticism is actually an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. It's almost like a necessary consequence of the Enlightenment, even though it is also a rebellion against it, sort of like a rejection of it, right? I would say especially this movement is an evolution of particularly the sort of French strain of Enlightenment. And maybe not so much the English or Scottish, maybe also the German. Remember, there's many different sort of strains or strands of Enlightenment, and I think the French strand, which brings us first the French Revolution, but then also the Terror and the rise of Napoleon, who is obviously maybe the quintessential Romantic figure. I would say is Napoleon, maybe Beethoven in the arts, but. And so this is, Romanticism is something that grows out of the Enlightenment, out of Enlightenment thinking, and sort of like how a revolution often comes sort of like back on itself, maybe like a snake eating its tail or whatever, right? So Romanticism is both an outgrowth of and ultimately a rejection of, to a great extent, the principles of the Enlightenment, right? It says here again. Now they're gonna talk about the arts a little bit. It says here, Romantic writers broke away from time-honored conventions and emphasized freedom of expression. We'll see some examples of that when they talk about poetry. Romantic painters used bolder, more brilliant colors and preferred dynamic motion to gracefully balanced poses. Hold on there a second. Preferred dynamic motion to gracefully balanced poses. Where have we seen that before, read that before? Well, it was back when we were talking about the transition from the Renaissance to the Baroque. I think almost that exact same sentence was used. Right? And this is kind of a clue of something, and that is that we kind of have like a pendulum that swings back and forth in the culture, in the arts certainly, from maybe what we might think of as more classically oriented modes to more romantic, and then back again from maybe more intellectual, more appealing to the head, to more emotional, appealing to the heart, right? So, for example, we started our historical survey here with the Middle Ages, right? And what defines the beginning of the Middle Ages? Well, it's like the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the end of the ancient world, you know. And the Middle Ages is a time, long period of time, sort of dominated by the church. People are largely, the majority of people are illiterate, ignorant, superstitious, right? The church is really the single most powerful authority, even more powerful, arguably, than the nobility. But then we move into the Renaissance. And what is the Renaissance? It's an attempt to get back at, to recapture the values of ancient Greece and Rome, which were lost in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and sort of a rejection of the Middle Ages. In fact, the term Middle Ages itself is a criticism invented during the Renaissance, looking back like, this Middle Age, this useless period of time. If we could get back to what was before, right, if we could recapture the grandeur of Greece and Rome, and we might start by rediscovering the philosophical, mathematical, scientific, artistic, whatever achievements of the greatest Greeks and Romans by examining their works, by reading their books and treatises, and then we can recreate that world and maybe even go beyond it, right? And that's the Renaissance humanist idea. Humanism, by the way, remember what humanism is all about. Not only trying to recapture the glory of Greece and Rome, but also the idea that all humans, in part because we are all children of God, right? If we really believe that we are all children of God, that God is our Father, then we all have innate dignity, right? All human beings have innate dignity. That's kind of a new idea in the Renaissance that was not so prevalent in the Middle Ages, right? Okay, so we have the Renaissance. And then we move from the Renaissance into the Baroque. And this is when we see, for example, in the arts, painters reject the sort of the classical posing of Renaissance statues and paintings, figures and paintings, which in turn had been inspired by what they saw in ancient Greek and Roman art. And instead, Baroque painters and sculptors preferred dynamic motion and poses that were often kind of like contorted and twisted to suggest motion. And the subject matter was often much more sort of like shocking. And the colors were more vivid and bold and all of this. And why? Because Baroque artists are trying to appeal to the emotions. That's what the Baroque was all about, right? Trying to get an emotional response from the viewer in the case of a painting or a statue, or from the listener in the case of a piece of music. So that we talked about the values of the Baroque era and all that implied and how it manifested itself in the music. Well, that, again, the pendulum swings back the other way and we get to the classical era. And all of that emotion is seen as kind of like a little over the top. And that's where we get the word Baroque. Baroque, remember that term, is a criticism. It means exaggerated, distorted, overly complex, maybe overly decorated, embellished, right? The classical style is more clean, more pure, and emotions are restrained somewhat, all right? because to be overly emotional is like in poor taste. And instead, we had this idea that beauty is the most important thing. And where does beauty come from? It's not just in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is generated by perfection of form. How do we achieve perfection of form? Well, through balance, proportion, symmetry, right? Those are the classical values. Well, now we are rebelling and the pendulum is swinging, and we have this romantic idea that beauty is, in fact, in the eye of the beholder. It's not based on some kind of dry mathematical calculation of, what are the proportions, the symmetry, all that stuff. No, it's not. It's something much more mysterious, very difficult to understand because it takes place in the heart rather than in the head, right? It's where we get this very romantic, in the common sense idea, the idea of love at first sight, right? And who can say what the heart wants, what it wants, and what you might find beautiful, I might not, and all that is fine, right? That's kind of like our modern day conception of beauty, I think, is very much a romantic one. I think most people do believe these days that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what you might find beautiful, I don't, and that's okay. Not a classical idea at all, right? All right, so I'm kind of going off on tangents. It's unavoidable when talking about romanticism. It's huge. It has so many implications. But my main point here, the last couple minutes, was the idea of the pendulum swinging back and forth in the arts and culture, right? And over the course that we've been taking, it's from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, back to the Baroque, and to the Classical era, and now over to the Romantic era. And remember, the Romantic era, the word itself implies an appreciation for the Middle Ages. Now, you might think, especially if you think like a Renaissance man or a person from the Enlightenment, you might think the Middle Ages. How could you be enthusiastic for the Middle Ages when there was so much, war and ignorance and superstition and disease, and people lived pretty much horrible lives, which only started to improve during the Renaissance, and then during the Scientific Revolution, and then during the Enlightenment. That's when we sort of climbed out of the mud of the Middle Ages and began. How could you be enthusiastic for the Middle Ages? We'll talk about why in a second. Let's continue working from the book a little bit here, and we'll talk about the Middle Ages aspect of it. Romanticism, it says here, was too diverse and complex to be defined by any single formula. Absolutely true. It aimed to broaden horizons and encompass the totality of human experience. The Romantic movement was international in scope and influenced all the arts. Definitely true. Here's an important sentence. Emotional subjectivity was a basic quality of Romanticism in art. Right? Remember that the classical approach was much more objective, right? And even like what generates beauty, balance, proportion, symmetry, those are objective things. Those are things out there. Those are like eternal principles. They're not something in here, right? The Romantic rejects that and says, no. Emotional subjectivity rather than intellectual objectivity, right, is the basic quality of what makes great art. And here's a wonderful quote by William Wordsworth, the greatest English Romantic poet. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now you might read that and think, yeah, that sounds right, I don't know if you're a poetry enthusiast or not, but that sentence, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That's something that I think an 18th century poet, a poet of the Enlightenment, would say, that's nonsense. That sounds like a recipe for bad poetry. It's not spontaneous. Good poetry isn't spontaneous. It is meticulously structured, right? We've got an overall poetic structure. We've got verse, which has a certain meter. We have a certain rhyme scheme. And it's not just an overflow of feelings. We're trying to communicate something important, some kind of universal truths or whatever. We're not just like barfing up feelings, random, spontaneous feelings, right? That sounds like bad poetry. Well, it's a different. I think the romantic poet is sort of like trying to bypass your brain and appeal directly to your heart. They mention another poet, American poet, Walt Whitman, who began his greatest work, Leaves of Grass, with the following words: I celebrate myself and sing myself. Actually, the next line is, he says in the poem, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. And what he means by that, it's, I'm going to be, Whitman is sort of announcing, I'm going to be sort of like taking you on a tour of my experience, and you're going to see the world through my eyes, right? And what I assume, you shall also assume. So I'm going to sort of like draw you into my experience, and you're going to experience what I experience, and you will see how much your life, your inner life, is also like mine. It's obviously going to be different in some ways, but although my experience is very subjective and very personal to me, by expressing it, you will see how much of it applies to you, and you will see how universal it is. And I think this is something that I think we find certainly in Beethoven, who in music absolutely pointed the way towards Romanticism. When we get to Beethoven's middle period and his late period, think of like the middle period. What is it that defines the middle period of Beethoven? What is he going through? This great crisis of this long onset of deafness, right? And this struggle sort of against his fate. His fate appears to be to go deaf, but he is kind of struggling against his fate. How? By the act of continuing to compose and to create his art and to express himself through it, and often with extremes of emotion, right? Not carefully balanced, proportional, restrained emotions, but extremes, right? That's exactly the kind of thing that other romantic artists, composers, painters, poets, whatever, are striving to do. In music, Beethoven sort of is the template for this going forward. And romantic composers idolized Beethoven more than any other musician, I think. In exploring their inner lives, the Romantics were especially drawn to the realm of fantasy, the unconscious, the irrational, the world of dreams. I think I've talked about this. They mention also like the Gothic tale, that like horror fiction, Dracula, Frankenstein, right? The works of Edgar Allan Poe are all from this period. And what is it about like this horror stories like this, tales of the supernatural, and they're trying to frighten you, right? And what is a fear? But sometimes fear is rational, but they're trying to bypass your rational mind. They're trying to get your heart to pound and get you to feel chills. They're trying to bypass your mind and get right to your emotions. And maybe the most immediate way to do that is to appeal to fear, right? Okay. Let's get now to this bit about the Middle Ages. The Romantic fascination with fantasy was paired with an enthusiasm for the Middle Ages, that time of chivalry and romance. There's the word, romance. That's what we mean by romance. Ruined castles, knights in shining armor, glorious battles. Now, why? And they give several examples of that, like Sir Walter Scott, one of the leading writers of the time, The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, which was written, by the way, one of the reasons that Victor Hugo wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame is because he wanted Notre Dame Cathedral itself to be preserved in its medieval state. It had been revised over there. For example, the stained glass windows had been taken out and clear glass was put in to allow more light into the Victor Hugo thought this was terrible. We should preserve it as it was, The idea of preserving medieval buildings rather than making changes to them to make them more practical or knocking them down altogether, which sometimes happened. All right. So this is, again, something that goes across the arts: music, literature, architecture. Right. Okay, so why this fascination with the Middle Ages, given how really horrible in many ways the Middle Ages were, especially for average people? Well, I think we have to step back a little bit and take a look at what is going on in the 19th century, right? In addition to maybe characterizing the 19th century as the Romantic Age in terms of like culture and the arts, what else is going on in the 19th century? The Industrial Revolution, right? And what does that mean? Well, during the Industrial Revolution, which really begins maybe in the late 1700s in England, but quickly spreads throughout Europe, Europe becomes industrialized and urbanized. And what that means is there's this tremendous shift of the population, which, remember, up till now, the vast majority of people, I've said over and over again, lived out in the countryside and worked the land because farming was very labor intensive and you just needed a lot of people to grow enough food to feed everybody. And cities, up until the 19th century, even the biggest cities of Europe were pretty small. Only a few cities were more than 100,000 people. Most cities were very small. But once we have the Industrial Revolution, once we have, for example, mechanization and labor-saving devices in agriculture, to start with agriculture, that means you don't need as many people to grow the crops. But what are all these people going to do? Well, they're going to get jobs in the cities, working at factories. They're going to be maybe coal miners because you need coal to make iron and steel and to power the railroads, which eventually begin crisscrossing Europe and America, right? And so you have this massive shift of the population from the countryside into the cities. And over the course of the 19th century, the cities double, triple, sometimes even quadruple in size in a very short time. And so you have people packed together, living in crowded, high-rise buildings, working long hours, working in factories very often in sort of what we might call dehumanizing conditions, right? Working in coal mines or whatever. Even like the white-collar people, I mean, think of like a Christmas Carol and Bob Cratchit. What does he do all day, 6 days a week? He's working, he's one of the lucky ones. At least he's working in an office, but he's doing kind of like drudgery work for fairly low pay, and he lives in a probably a pretty small apartment, and so people in this circumstance, what are they yearning for, right? People who live in New York City today, what do they yearn for? To get out of New York City, or at least to get to Central Park, where they can enjoy the grass and the trees and the birds chirping, right? And this points to actually another, maybe the single most important element of Romanticism in the arts, which is this love of nature, because that's one of the things that they've lost by urbanizing. Another thing that they've lost, talking about the Middle Ages, is there comes this notion that kind of percolates to the surface in this urbanized society. We had it better back in the old days. Our great-great-great-grandfathers, who were peasants, living in little villages, living in essentially in nature, in the countryside, who were sort of like, whose lives were in tune with the seasons, right? There's a time for planting and a time for harvesting. Now, this is all very much a romanticization of the Middle Ages. People were romanticizing it, making it out to be better than it really was. But that's what they yearned for, because that's what they had lost in this transition to an urban, industrialized society. They yearned for the pre-urban, pre-industrialized life that they might have never experienced, but they knew their ancestors had, and they thought of those as sort of like the good old days. And what's more, um, you know, there's a certain dignity in being a peasant farmer, even though you were, way down in the totem pole of society, rather than being just like a cog in a machine working in a dirty factory all day, right? And there was, there was beauty in the Middle Ages, wasn't there? There were the beautiful cathedrals, and there were beautiful castles, and there was heroism, in these romantic tales. Life somehow had more meaning and purpose, right? Again, this is a romanticization of the medieval, but this is, I think, in part where this longing, where this yearning, this appreciation for the Middle Ages comes from. And writers and poets and painters or whatever, and architects too, kind of all tapped into this. So, so look at some of these paintings that you see. Over here on page 221, The Gleaners by Millet. And it's just three women out in the field, peasant women, and picking up the leftover grain in the fields. But at least they're out in nature, right? And it's a beautiful scene, simple but beautiful. This love of nature is everywhere in Romantic art, right? Notice, for example, they have a painting by Caspar David Friedrich here on page 219. And this is very typical of Caspar David Friedrich. If you Google him and you see these images come up, there's usually a glorious sunset in the background. And there will be people in the foreground, but you usually just see their backs. And you see that they must have come out of the city or the town to get out into nature and stand there and appreciate the beautiful sunset, right? So the idea of like this romanticism of nature, of seeing in nature, I mean, everybody loves nature, right? And poets have always written about nature. But the Romantic poets and artists saw nature as sort of like, I think, as the book expresses it, as sort of like a mirror of the human heart, that you can see things going on in nature and they somehow they correspond to your emotional state in a way that is difficult to kind of express rationally. Okay, so this fascination with the Middle Ages, and maybe especially with nature, is an hugely important aspect of Romanticism. They talk about the Gothic revival in architecture. And they mention specifically the Houses of Parliament. If you can conjure up in your mind or Google, the Houses of Parliament in London, Big Ben, that was built in the 1860s, but it was built to look like it had been built in the Middle Ages. It's in the Gothic style. Now, it's Gothic revival because we're trying to revive the Gothic style. But it's a sort of a 19th century revival of medieval style, and we see this style all over Europe. And so we're building new buildings in this Gothic style, and also maybe trying to preserve the old buildings, like Notre Dame Cathedral or Cologne Cathedral. Cologne Cathedral is a fascinating example. It's one of the largest cathedrals in the world. If you Google Cologne Cathedral, if you've ever been to Cologne, Germany, Cologne Cathedral was begun in the Middle Ages, and construction stopped sometime around the 1400s, and it was left unfinished for 400 years. And then in the 19th century, some money was raised, and they decided to finally finish the thing, right? So, and that's really the symbol of Cologne more than anything else is the cathedral, and it was completed during the 19th century. Okay, and they mention here, of all the inspirations for Romantic art, none was more important than nature. Right? Definitely. Romanticism coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which caused vast social and economic changes. Right? this is definitely a transformative time in in Europe, and also a period characterized by, again, violent upheavals and revolutions as the middle class. Now, this is a trend we saw beginning in the 18th century. Remember, I said that the middle class is sort of resents the special privileges of the nobility and the clergy, and they begin asserting their rights, demanding their rights. And this movement is intensified by urbanization, because now these are the people who are moving to the cities, right? They're not scattered out in the countryside. They are concentrated in the cities. It's easier to have a revolution if you have a bunch of people, maybe people who are not so happy with their lives, who are demanding political equality or better social conditions. If they're concentrated in the cities, that's kind of like, you have the potential for like a powder keg. And so we might also characterize the 19th century as the age of revolutions, especially maybe the most famous of these revolutions. The year 1848 and into 1849 saw revolutions throughout Europe. It was like a conflagration that spread throughout. But there are other, 1830 we have revolutions in Paris, 1848, and then later elsewhere. But those are the main ones to know, and you might have learned about them in your history classes. We're not going to have time to get into them too much. But one of our we're not going to get to the composer Richard Wagner, but Wagner, for example, was actually involved in the revolutions of 1848, 1849. I think he was trying to transport guns to aid the revolutionaries, and he had to flee and spend years in exile. He had to leave Germany and settle in Switzerland. Anyway, let's move on and talk a little bit about Romanticism in music. So getting specifically to musical characteristics. They start off here, page 222, with a list of composers. And I'm just going to state right off the bat, we are not going to get through all of these composers. We are not going to get through this entire chapter. We just don't have enough time. So really, this unit is going to focus on Romanticism generally, but then the early Romantic composers. So we will look at the first, maybe 7 or 8 of these. Franz Schubert, Robert Schumann and his wife Clara Wieck Schumann, Frederick Chopin, Franz Liszt, Felix Mendelssohn, and his sister Fanny Mendelssohn Henselt, Hector Berlioz, and that's about as far as we're going to get, unfortunately. We're just going to kind of run out of time. So I'm not going to test you on those other composers. But I will test you on those few, and also on these general characteristics of Romanticism. Okay. Composers, this is the second paragraph, composers of the Romantic period continued to use the musical forms of the preceding classical era. And so that means we're not going to have to spend a lot of time talking about form. We've already talked quite a bit about form in the classical era, and these forms continue to be used in the Romantic era. The Romantics were generally not, with some exceptions, they were not really innovators in form. They weren't interested so much in form. That's more of a classical thing, right? The classical idea is that beauty itself is generated by form. The Romantics are not so much interested in form. They're more interested in the content that goes into the form. And so they're happy to just continue. The form isn't as important to them as the content. So yeah, we might as well just continue to use the forms that we already know of from the previous classical masters. The emotional intensity associated with Romanticism was already present in the work of Mozart, and particularly in that of Beethoven. So we can see it's sort of a trend. The Romantics did look at Mozart, especially certain works like Don Giovanni, and we focused on Don Giovanni. What does Don Giovanni have? First of all, it has this heroic anti-hero kind of figure, and it has the supernatural, right? This statue that comes to life and drags Don Giovanni down into hell. All of that was very appealing to the Romantics, okay? And the figure of Mozart himself, of course, who died young, who wasn't appreciated by Viennese public, and it was only later his music was reappreciated again. So the Romantics kind of actually looked at Mozart as one of their own, and definitely Beethoven, sort of cast a shadow over the entire Romantic era. And all Romantic composers, to some extent, I think, were trying to sort of live up to the example of Beethoven. Beethoven was the standard to try and aspire to. Nonetheless, there are many differences between Romantic and classical music. Romantic works tend to have greater ranges of tone color, dynamics, and pitch, and I would say also tempo, and also the harmonic vocabulary is broadened. The orchestra is greatly expanded. Form, so we'll touch on each of these, but forms are often either greatly expanded or greatly concentrated. So maybe the way to think of this in general is take any aspect of music, any element of music which we covered in our very first unit on the elements of music, and think of each of those aspects or elements having like a range from 1 to 10, right? So for example, tempo can be slow or fast. Dynamics can be soft or loud, right? A musical form can be maybe on a smaller scale, like a miniature, or it can be very large. All of these different aspects, instead of going from, from 1 to 10, think of it as going from, negative 100 to 100, right? The range, the parameters, the envelope, this cliche of pushing the boundaries, expanding horizons, broadening the envelope, whatever. That is definitely a feature of Romanticism. So, for example, let's just take something like dynamics, right? For a typical classical composer, like, let's say, Mozart, in his music would indicate dynamics, how loud or how soft you should play. But the range was usually from pianissimo, 2 Ps, to piano, 1 P, mezzo piano, medium soft, medium loud, mezzo forte, forte, and then fortissimo, which is 2 Fs. And that's basically enough, from very soft to very loud and anything in between. And we can have crescendos, we can have decrescendos. So that was sort of like the set of options that a typical classical composer drew from. Now Beethoven expands this. We sometimes see triple pianissimo or triple forte, but the Romantics go even further. It's not unusual to see written into a 19th century composition 4 Ps or 5 Ps, 4 Fs, 5 Fs, right? So the standard dynamic range isn't enough for them. They want to expand it, right? Have extremes of loud and soft and everything in between, right? So think of that, apply that to any aspect of music, and this is what we're talking about as we move into the Romantic era. So let's work through some of these characteristics. Number one, individuality of style. So that's a basic characteristic of a Romantic approach, individuality. This was not as much the case in the classical era. Now, certainly Beethoven, again, everything that I talk about here in terms of classical characteristics applies more to early Beethoven. Later Beethoven is more of a Romantic, so this is where a lot of this stuff comes from, the influence of Beethoven. But think of an early work by Beethoven, or a work by Mozart, a work by Haydn, a work by other classical composers that we didn't get to. They all kind of conform to the classical approach. There's sort of a generally agreed upon approach or language, if you will, or vocabulary or style that they are all working in. And it's an international style. So, for example, a composer in Italy will compose a symphony, and it'll sound more or less very much like a composer from France or a composer from Austria. Or a composer in England. There's an international, generally agreed upon style, right? And if you were to listen to one or the other, you wouldn't really be able to tell, like, oh, this sounds Italian, whereas this sounds French. That is very different as we move into the 19th century, and it ties into another very important ism of Romanticism, and that is nationalism. The 19th century, among other things, is the age of nationalism. It's a time when people generally, but also artists and composers, whatever, become much more attuned to their national identity. There are many, many reasons for this. One of them is certainly the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, Napoleon's invasion of an overrunning of much of Europe, and the reaction against that, kind of lights this flame of nationalism, which is a sort of like the it just kind of like goes right along with, it's baked into the cake almost, of Romanticism. So that means that individual composers, not only do they have their own individual style, which is clearly distinguishable, but often that individual style, the reason it is clearly distinguishable from each other in a way that, let's say, early Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart are harder to distinguish. It's very easy to distinguish someone like Schubert versus Chopin versus Liszt versus Tchaikovsky versus Wagner. They all have a much more individual style where you listen, you say, oh, that's definitely Chopin. And the instant you hear it, you can tell that it's Chopin. You would not mistake Chopin for anybody else, right? As a very distinctive sound. And part of that is because of his Polish heritage, right? And his Polish nationalism. And that you could say the same for Liszt and his Hungarian, and Tchaikovsky for his Russian background. So we have much more individual style. It's much more easy to tell one of these composers from the other compared to the classical era. And it's much more sort of like nationalized and regionalized. There's a distinctive French sound, a distinctive Italian sound, a distinctive Polish or Russian sound. That is not so much the case in an earlier time in the classical era. Expressive aims and subjects. Okay, so Romanticism is all about being expressive. The Romantics explored a universe of feeling that included flamboyance and intimacy, unpredictability and melancholy, rapture and longing, extremes of emotion, right? Again, contrary to the classical approach, which was keeping the emotions in check, never going to extremes, keeping everything within the bounds of good taste. No. The Romantics are about exploding those bounds and exploring the extremes of emotion, sometimes from one second to the next. We go from this extreme downcast to this extreme exuberance, So juxtaposing these extremes of emotions right next to each other. Fascination with the fantastic and the diabolical, but by fantastic we mean having to do with fantasy, right? The supernatural. Romantics were all into that, and we'll see specific examples of this when we look at Schubert and his song The Erlking, and Hector Berlioz and his Symphonie Fantastique, his fantastic symphony. This is also, by the way, they talk about this in the next paragraph here. The Romantic era is the great age of program music. We've already talked about program music a little bit because remember I said that Vivaldi's Seasons, right, that like the Spring Concerto that we looked at back in the Baroque era, that's an example of program music. That is instrumental music which attempts to paint a picture or tell a story, a kind of a specific story. And the story is sort of suggested, first and foremost, by the title, right? And it might be more or less specific, but if we have a descriptive title of some kind that gives the audience an idea of what they should be feeling or what they should be imagining in a piece of purely instrumental music where we don't have words to go on, right? Then that is program music. And the 19th century is really the glorious age of program music. And again, contrast this with the classical era. Most classical era works have a generic, non-descriptive title. It doesn't tell you what it's about. It'll be a title like Symphony Number 2, or String Quartet Number 3, or Piano Sonata Number 4, right? Or Concerto in E major, something like that. The title doesn't tell you anything except what kind of a piece it is. But when we move into the Romantic era, audiences want more. They want to know, what am I supposed to be feeling? What should I be imagining, right? And so composers kind of give them what they want and start using these sort of descriptive titles more and more. And thinking in terms of connections to the other arts, right? To drama, to painting, to poetry, right? And that's what program music is all about, and we will see some examples of program music. In fact, sometimes, like the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz, the program, the story, is drawn from Berlioz's own life. It's sort of like slightly fictionized, autobiographical description of sort of this experience that Berlioz himself went through. Again, we can see actually some foreshadowing of this in Beethoven. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is called the Pastoral Symphony, and sort of like Vivaldi's Seasons, actually, it's pastoral, meaning like outdoors. Sort of there's this nature theme to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, and each movement is a sort of like a different scene out in nature, and there's a thunderstorm, and there's like, happy peasants dancing and all this kind of thing. So again, another thing that was anticipated by Beethoven that we see more and more of in the Romantic era. Nationalism and exoticism. So I've already talked a little bit about nationalism, right? And how this helps to create a sort of a distinctive sound for composers from different national regions who very much identify with their culture, with their language, with their traditions, with their folklore, all of this. But there's also something called exoticism, and that is maybe not so much drawing on your own culture as the source of inspiration, but on some foreign culture which is strange and exotic. That the Romantics loved anything that was strange and mysterious and exotic, and cultures that were unfamiliar, maybe from the Far East, like Japan and China. So we have operas that are set in Japan, like Madame Butterfly, or in China, like Turandot, or maybe within the gypsy culture within Europe, right? This mysterious subculture that kind of keep to themselves and move around from place to place. The gypsies, the Romantics were fascinated with the gypsies. So Bizet's opera Carmen, you might not be familiar with by title, but I'm sure you've heard bits of Carmen, which has to do in part with the gypsy culture. So that's another, fascination with strange, mysterious foreign cultures is another aspect of Romanticism. We call that exoticism. Let's talk about expressive tone color. So this is another one of these things where I said, take any parameter of music and broaden it. That's what the Romantics were trying to do. And the most important development here to talk about is the expansion of the orchestra, right? So remember, the orchestra has evolved over time from its beginnings in the Baroque era as basically just the strings, violin, viola, cello, bass, plus a harpsichord. That was the Baroque orchestra. And if you wanted extra instruments, you could add them on an a la carte basis. But the standard orchestra was just the strings plus a harpsichord. We move into the classical era. The orchestra basically doubles in size, and although the harpsichord goes away, we have all the strings, and maybe even a bigger string section, and we also have woodwinds, like 4 different woodwind instruments in pairs. We have 2 flutes, 2 clarinets, 2 oboes, and 2 bassoons. We have brass, 2 trumpets, 2 French horns, and we have percussion, 2 timpani drums. Boom, 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 right? So that's the typical classical orchestra. We move into the Romantic era, and the orchestra again doubles in size. The modern symphony orchestra is essentially the Romantic orchestra, because now we have even more additional brass, woodwind, and percussion instruments. So, for example, trombones and tubas become standard, and we have to add to the French horns, right? And in the winds, we have not just flute, but also piccolo. Remember the very high-pitched version of the flute. And in addition to the oboe, we have the English horn. In addition to the bassoon, we have the contrabassoon, which is an octave lower. And we have the harps added to the orchestra at this time. We have many more percussion instruments. And since we have all of these additional wind and brass and percussion instruments, we also have to beef up the strings in order to have a tonal balance. So the modern orchestra is essentially the Romantic orchestra, and it's about 100 people. Giant orchestra. And with this giant orchestra, you can achieve extremes of volume, right, that were impossible for a classical orchestra or a Baroque orchestra. Right? Think of all those brass and percussion instruments playing full blast, and you can get tremendous, overwhelming sound. But you can have only a few instruments play at a time and have, extremely soft sounds. In addition to this, with all of these different tone colors, you can combine them in interesting ways that were unavailable. It's like you've got a palette with additional colors. So you've got those colors themselves, but you can blend them in interesting ways. So the 19th century is definitely the age of orchestration in music. That is orchestration, the arranging for the orchestra, and aside from writing the melodies and the harmonies and whatever, but then paying particular attention to which instruments are going to play this melody, which maybe combination of instruments, and finding unusual combinations of instruments that strike the listener like, wow, I never thought of that before, combining, the English horn with the viola, with the timpani or whatever in this particular passage to create kind of a unique sound, and tailoring a certain melody, thinking, this melody is definitely the kind of thing that the oboe should play. This is an oboe-esque melody, whereas this is a more suited to a clarinet. Composers start thinking in orchestral terms, and certain composers like Tchaikovsky is a great example. Berlioz is a great example. Berlioz kind of invented orchestration almost, not really. He wrote the book, literally. He wrote a standard textbook on orchestration that is still used today. The Russians in particular were known for their great orchestration. Wagner, the greatest German opera composer, perhaps, certainly the greatest of the 19th century. We won't get to Wagner, we won't have enough time, but a master of orchestration. Right? So orchestration becomes a big deal in the 19th century. And also, I'll probably have to leave off with this, but the piano finally comes into its modern form in the 19th century. So remember, the piano was invented way back in 1700, doesn't really catch on until like the 1750s or the 1760s. But the piano that was available to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven is not quite the full-blown modern piano. It was, first of all, we have not yet gotten to the Industrial Revolution. The modern piano has a cast iron frame, whereas earlier pianos had frames made out of wood. With a cast iron frame, you can have higher tension on the strings. You can have more strings, which means you can have higher notes and lower notes. You can have a greater dynamic range, right? So the piano really comes into its own and is capable, really, of rivaling the orchestra in some cases. Like, people heard great pianists like Franz Liszt play, and it was like an entire orchestra coming out of his fingers, right? We find some composers, like Frédéric Chopin, wrote for practically nothing other than the piano. He just dove into the piano and did nothing else, right? Kind of unique in a way. Other composers who were great pianists like Franz Liszt and Johannes Brahms, whatever, wrote a great deal for piano, but also for other instruments, for orchestra, etc. But the final evolution of the piano is another important part of the 19th century, and the piano is certainly, I think, the dominant single instrument. Maybe if you don't consider the orchestra an instrument, the piano is the most important single instrument of the 19th century. I think a great deal of music is written for it. I'll also, I guess, while I'm on this, I am going to wrap up soon. The 19th century is certainly the age also of virtuosity. What do we mean by virtuosity? Extreme technical skill. This is the age when instrumentalists, people like the violinist Niccolo Paganini, the pianist Franz Liszt, and many others, achieve sort of superhuman ability on the instrument. Things that were sort of undreamed of, even by Beethoven or Mozart, in terms of technical, in terms of lots of notes and technical challenges, right? It's sort of like the difference if you watch footage of basketball players from the 50s and 60s, and they're all like doing layups and whatever, and they're obviously skilled, but put them up against someone like, Michael Jordan and LeBron James, and there's just no comparison, because the level of technical skill, like in athletics, we're used to this, but we see it now happening in music, right? The technical ability reaches astonishing new levels, and this is what audiences very often want to go to see. They want to see virtuoso performers doing the unthinkable, the impossible, right? Right. So, I think I will leave off here, and I will briefly take up some of these elements that I just kind of ran out of time and didn't get to. And then we will start to talk about the composer Franz Schubert, the first of our romantics, we might say, who is really, kind of like Beethoven, had one foot in the classical era and one foot in the romantic era, had a very different career from Beethoven. So we'll wrap up our discussion of Romanticism in music. We'll start to talk about Schubert, and we will listen to one of his greatest compositions, an art song, new genre of music, new to the Romantic era, kind of, an art song called The Erlking. So we'll see you then.